here we have the Unity user interface, and this is the hierarchy window. This is where everything that's in your game scene will turn up. If we put something in here, you should see it in this window here. I'll just drag the scene view up to here. You can see the windows are interchangeable. You can drag them around and move them to wherever you feel happy with. You can even create your own layouts if you want down here. You can save them, etc. But generally speaking, the layouts they provide are pretty decent. The wide layout's pretty good, although you get the hierarchy down here. I quite often like to just drag it back up there. That leaves us in a nice spot. Don't worry about any of these things at the moment. They refer to one of the game objects that's selected. So when you select one over here, it ends up in the right hand panel on your inspector, and you should see some settings available on the components. These components are actually dealing with post-processing effects inside a global volume. So even though we can see that the scale of this global volume is 1, and there's no actual shape or mesh on it that we can see growing, it's actually set to be a global, which means it doesn't have a distance attached to it. The magnitude is infinite effectively, or equated to 1 but infinite. So whatever's inside this whole game world basically will be affected by these. Get a bloom and tone map, which is why at the moment that's happening. This is the main camera. Generally speaking, you'll have one camera to deal with most things. However, quite often people have a separate UI camera, which can handle it. Cameras are pretty cheap inside game worlds, as long as you don't go mental. They're pretty cheap to use, especially if they're statically based and they're only sort of rendering, UI. The main camera in your game should obviously be focused on your player or whatever your scene view is. However, there is a cool system in Unity called Timeline and Cine Machine, which can create a lovely sort of dolly effect sort of camera system where you could lay up different cameras that are triggered when you walk into certain zones, etc. Something that we'll look at down the line perhaps, but for basic stuff, this is your camera, and over here is the actual object. This is what you should see, this icon. This is the camera component, and although there's lots and lots of stuff there, we will look over them. They're not really too important to get the job done that you need at this moment. All you want is this camera to follow it. Okay. This is a script that will make the camera sort of shake and move around, but we'll take that off for a minute. And yeah, so there's a directional light in the scene. If I pop that in, we can't see anything at the moment. What's happening with that? The intensity is 1. Let's see. Well, let's do this, shall we? Let's create a new 3D cube object. Let's find out where that is. At the moment it's there, so let's reset the transform, and we can do that by holding the right click and resetting it. Now we can go and have a look at it, and let's bring the camera down to here as well. And we do that, we do that. Bringing the camera back a little bit should pop that object into view. And you can see the tiny little camera object down here, which helps us to see everything we want. It can go any way you feel like it, but there you go. Just draw it back a little bit so we can see it. Maybe draw it up, and then on the X value, I don't know, just do like 15 or something so we're looking down. Now in the game view, that's what we'll be able to see. And this directional light should help us to change some values here, right? So if we move this around, you should see that the cube will be affected by the color. The thing is that this is an arbitrary color and affects everything in the game scene. So really, you're looking for one kind of color that fits the bill of all of it. So we're just going to leave it like that for a minute. So there's the cube. There is the cube. And the cool thing about this is that you can just go and add components to this object. These components are important to using it. For example, the mesh filter helps us to identify the mesh in the world as points. So if we clicked on that, you can't actually see it, but if we clicked on it, you would see something similar to you would see that. Basically, that is the mesh filter. And this mesh filter is showing us the tries that are connected together to create that cube. They're actually connected by the vertex points on each area here, but there is a triangle drawn across, and those triangles make one one face. So let's move over and go to the mesh renderer, and the mesh renderer allows us to see, well, it's used both. The mesh renderer allows us to see this face on the top, the shaded face. So it's always got a material applied to it. That material here is one of the standard Unity materials that's in the Universal RP runtime. We can go and put something like that in it. That gives us a spatial material, simple lit, particles. We can just drag and drop these things on, it's no biggie, but we can make our own materials, and that's what we'll do later on. Let's just get ourselves back up to assets. So yeah, here's the cube, and then so the mesh renderer provides a material, identifies whether it can be shadow casting or not. Let's look at that in action. Let me just go and create a plane. Sorry, let's create a plane. Just drop that down a little bit, and there we go. Can you see the shadow that it's casting now? And if I change the directional light by doing this, you'll see the shadow is casting accordingly. All right. And that's the beauty of a directional light, is that it's good for all of the static shadows in your game, especially at the start. So we'll turn this one off, for example, and we still see that. But let's go to the cube, and if I turn this one off, you can see it removes the shadows. There you go. Very strange. Cool. So we can just keep that on. Static shadow caster, no, don't worry. We could contribute to the global illumination if this was an emission texture, but that's something we'll look at as well later. We'll keep all this on. It's stuff that you don't need to worry about just yet. We'll use it when we meet it. And so we get to the box collider component. The box collider component allows us to effectively create a collision mesh around the object that we've got. You can see this is quite primitive. It gives us an access to each of the faces or sides, or we could just literally make it larger or smaller or whatever. And that the reason we might do something like that is that we might change it to be an is trigger object. And if you look here, it says if enabled, the collider is used for triggering events and is ignored by the physics engine. So we don't actually need this to be a physics object to get interactions with something else, but the thing that interacting with it does need to be a rigid body, which is a physics engine object. So you'll see that again when we do that in a little bit, but that we would tick that, and this collision item would now become a trigger. So let me show you how to prove that. I'm going to make another cube, and I'm going to pull that cube over here. I'm going to make that not on the whole thing like that, and I'm going to add a rigid body. And this is how we do it. There's an add component element down here. The add component element is designed perfectly to be clicked and searched. If you search rigid, you'll get this. This is the rigid body object. We're going to take gravity off of it, but I'm going to use it and this box collider to effectively collide with this object, right? So first and foremost, let me one these out as well. Keep that off. Now when I play the game, and just let that start up for the first time. Hold on. So now if I go to here and I bring this in, you should see there is an issue. So if I bring that down to here, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so that definitely collides with it. But if we take this object and I make it a trigger, Now when I do this, I grab this object and drag it to it, no problems. Now what that means is that this object here can actually have something like a script on it that could affect the, or this object here could have a script on it that could effectively run once this object, as long as we identified it, collided or triggered or intersected this object here. So let's do that really quickly. Here's the object. We can go into here and add a component, and instead of typing whatever we want to find inside the component list, because there's loads as you can see down here, we want to do scripts, and we could get to it that way, but we could just do this, trigger my object, and because we've written something unique, it already knows we probably want to make a script, so we can just enter our way through that or return our way through it, and then once that's done, it'll get itself loaded in, bang, straight into here, into Visual Studio or whatever I run into edit the scripts. Once we're into here, we can get rid of this because we don't need it just yet. We're going to write a new method called onTriggerEnter. Use this thing called other to capture the data of the object that's triggering, and if it is the trigger that we expect, then we should do something. So if other GameObject, and the reason we're getting that is because we want to access the GameObject itself. So other is the collider that should already be on the GameObject, so we're expecting the GameObject to hold a collider, and that will be referenced in other. And now we're going to use Unity's dot operator to call the GameObject and use a comparison using the compare tag method. The compare tag method can look at the tag of this object other and see whether it matches what we've just identified here. Once we've done that, there are faster ways of doing that, by the way, but we would probably do that just to get our initial contacts working, right? So let's first debug it and see whether we can see something happening in the console. Like that. Make sure you end it with your semicolons, and we'll just save that off, and hopefully if this collider is the one with our rigid body on it and we've named the tag of our rigid body player, we'll get this turn up in the console. Let me just get the console up. We'll get this in the console over here when it works. Okay. Might even turn it down here for us. Right, okay, so this has got the trigger. The one thing we have to do is over here is go over here and put this tag in. Everything else should be fine. So we'll run that. With any luck. Oh, let's have a look in the console. Triggered. Excellent. So if I just put them together like that, and we should see that. We should see that just keep on growing up. And what that means is that we could use this to trigger some sort of event. For example, if I just very quickly go over to this cube object, go over to here, bit of a bad way of thinking about this really, putting these screens that way, but there you go. If I went over to this object, for example, well, I could just very quickly, you know, for the sake of what it is, go and make a canvas. In that canvas, basically stick a, I don't know, some sort of text in there like that. Something like that over there. Just say that very simply, okay. And then what I could do is that on that trigger, I could have this canvas object be available to this script, and then turn this canvas object back on if the trigger occurs. So let's do that. Okay, let's go back into the script for trigger object. Let's go into here and just go, for the sake of ease, we're just going to use a public canvas. And we're going to be able to slot that into the inspector over here, really. Once this is ready to go, you should see a new area here, and we can basically grab that. Okay. And so I wanted to get the canvas so I could show you that we can access deeper than the canvas and get the objects that live underneath it, which is this text object, right? So back in here, once we've got this canvas, well, let's set, let's get canvas dot get component in children text mesh pro GUI. And we need to set that so we know that it is a text mesh pro GUI. TMP. Okay. Now we've got that, we can effectively set enable true, which means what we need to do now is that we effectively need to call this again. So let's go back up to here and let's make a private void array, and we'll do that. And we'll set text.enabled as such. Now this is not a very optimized way of doing it. What we should do is probably go and get this object here. We should go and grab that, stick that into there like that, probably go, well, text equals canvas.getEnabled that. We can now actually remove that. We can pop that into there. We've reduced the amount of calls to the same thing. That should give us, that's fine. We could get the canvas through the script as well, but we won't. We'll just leave it like that. Okay. And now we can get ourselves back to here. Should be able to push play. And we shouldn't see any text or anything, but if I go and grab this, and then I gently move it through, we should see the text like that. And we haven't told it to disappear afterwards. There is a way to do that, so just very quickly to finish that off, we just get ourselves over to here or something, and I'm literally just going to copy that one out, drop that into there, move around here to this point, and exit is the other option. Okay, and so we're just going to say false, and we're just going to say trigger exited. Now that's in place, we can get ourselves back into Unity, pop in to the game, and you can see straight out the box I've got my hello there. If I leave the trigger, it disappears. So that's one of the first sort of forays into Unity we can use. It's just a bit of code controlling this object here, and that's just this one that's static at the moment. We can make that static as well, and usually when that happens it says change for children, etc. So anything that lives underneath it stays static. But it doesn't really matter, it still does the job for us. I mean, it's not going to move, so it saves the Unity engine a bit of time calculating. Anyway, that's it for today. It's just a really simple foray into Unity, so you understand that there are interactions that can occur. And remember, if I go back to that box trigger and take the trigger off and now try that, I'm probably not going to get the outcome I needed, that nothing is happening, the trigger is not occurring. There is another way we can do that, and it's called the on-collision methods, or the on-collision properties that we can access that are on the transform, or on the collider. It doesn't actually need a rigid body for that. However, it's not as quick as a trigger where we might need rigid body calculations to occur. So we'll get into the nuances of that later on, but generally speaking, that's it for now. There you are, quick foray into Unity. Next time we'll do something or something like that. Cheers.